Uh, Hi, everyone. Welcome to Run, Walk, Talk, Tales of Inclusion and Development. My name is Steph, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm here with Judy, and her pronouns are she and her. And today we're going to be talking about how to get started with equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI, in an organization.
And you are in the interviewee seat today, Steph. And with your EDI experience, I know that you'll have valuable insights and advice to share on really how to get started with EDI in an organization, or really how to grow EDI within an organization.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this today.
Yeah, I am too. All right, well, let's just dive in. So I'm curious to know, in your experience, what are some key steps that organizations should prioritize when they're actually starting a journey toward implementing EDI practices?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think one that a lot of people, when they're, kind of getting started, are thinking about. And I would say an assessment and figuring out kind of like an audit where you are in the organization right now is really important. That's always sort of, I feel like when you think of anything, do the assessment. And the assessment can be surveys, focus groups, interview questions, taking a look at your policies and practices, looking at kind of your data or demographics, what you have, and listening to people. And so the assessment and doing that audit, I say, would be the absolute sort of that first piece. And then through that information there, you create that strategy, right? And all along, you want to make sure that your leaders are on board and that that you're communicating with your leaders are having conversations, and that they know the why, that you're embarking on this journey. Another really key piece is, I think sometimes in organizations, when there's so much going on, you may forget to communicate the why, or you communicate it once or twice and think, great, everybody should know. And in reality, you need to kind of communicate again and again and again. Um, and then a couple other sort of pieces too, I would say, is the topic. I think, when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, there tends to be sort of sometimes the straight focus on diversity, and really looking at inclusion across the organization, and really focusing on inclusion, belonging, making sure that the people that are in the organization get the support they need. And you need budget and resources around that
Well,
too,
yeah, absolutely. We can't forget about that, right? Critical to have the financial support for the initiatives
That's
and the
right.
resources assigned to the initiatives that you want to roll out. And I think what you've said is so important, like having those initial conversations and really listening to people to understand, well, where are you at? What do people think about EDI? What is their understanding of it? And I think that leads us nicely into the next question for you, which is, what are some best practices in EDI that
Yeah.
anyone in EDI should be following? Are there best practices?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the best practices could be changing. Sure. I think throughout the years, I've read a lot of various sort of best practices. Um, one piece I would say is focus on what's right in your organization, in the sense of, and when I say that, I think social media is you know is very polarizing, right? When it comes to talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And companies go from being the best company on Monday to the worst company on Tuesday for something that is said or done or misunderstood, or,
Mhm.
and so really try to kind of put that into perspective, because I think some companies could potentially sort of be changing their strategies and flipping and flopping because they're like, oh, this is the best thing we should do, or today, and then next week it's not, because you will always get sort of sometimes disagreeing information. Um, I also think, when you're sort of starting this journey and you want to be implementing equity, diversity, and inclusion, you really do need to think about who you're going to hire. And what I have seen is, sometimes we start off with an equity, diversity, and inclusion specialist or coordinator. And I'm not telling you sort of what's right or wrong. I will just sort of share, when you hire somebody in a coordinator or specialist role, it does not have the same effect as hiring an EDI director who has, the experience, the knowledge, the title. And I know, in organizations, sometimes titles matter, sometimes they don't. And I think when we're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion in this space, having that title brings that sort of that clout and that experience and the transparency and authority. So that I would definitely consider looking at hiring someone in a senior role.
Mm-hmm.
And then, Judy, we talk about data a lot, from a best practice
We
perspective.
do. We do.
And because I think it's really important. And I think unfortunately, sometimes we just focus on the demographic data, when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that is absolutely important. However, you also need that qualitative, the stories, the how do people feel, to really get the full picture, So, and then I think sort of similar, another kind of best practice again that I sort of said before, when you're getting started, it's communicate, communicate, communicate. I mean, I've been doing this for 10 years and sometimes I catch myself, again, I feel like I'm in it day in and day out and it should just make sense. But everybody is so busy and they have best intentions. But you really need to kind of reiterate that context,
And when you're
Yeah.
saying communicate, I think from your previously what you said is, I mean, it's making sure that that message goes out, but then there's also that element of listening to what people are
Yes.
saying about that message, and are they understanding it, and are they
Yes.
getting it? And I think
Yeah.
that leads us nicely into, and you touched on this a little bit, but is it necessary to have an EDI department? Do they need to have an organization need to have people who are really dedicated to EDI? Does it need to be its own self-running department, or
Yeah.
can it be reporting into a different department?
Yeah. Yeah.
What have you seen work best?
Yeah.
Is there one way that works best?
Yeah. And I think from my perspective, I used to have, a very sort of strong opinion with regards to EDI should sit outside of HR because that's typically where it is. And
Hmm.
I think over the years, I've realized, and my experience and what I've seen is it really doesn't matter potentially where it sits as long as that leader that you have is a strong EDI advocate, giving you the sort of that champion. So I think when we talk about, is it a department or how many roles and whatnot, I think I see, again, typically it starts with one person, and usually that person sits in HR and they're
Hmm.
very interested in the topic. So it's sort of
Hmm.
like they've already started to do it and they put their hand up.
Hmm.
And I think, you know, um, again, like I said, sort of whether it sits in the strategy office or the HR,
Hmm.
I think sometimes, again, it depends on the leader. I
Yeah.
think, and I think that, and I think sometimes we've chatted a bit about this. Traditional HR sometimes is in, it's very much this is the policy, the practice, this is how it is.
Hmm.
And EDI is trying to kind of stretch those, focus on equity. It's not that, everybody gets the same all the time,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So there
Hmm.
can sometimes be a bit of that conflict. But kind of going back to sort of your original question around whether it's a department or not, the reality is for many years, companies have grown and they haven't had this lens, right? I do consider it sort of the equity, diversity, and inclusion glasses, right? Like you put
Hmm.
it on, similar to kind of like, that learning and development that you have, like you see things differently.
Hmm.
And if you don't dedicate the sort of the time and the resource and have somebody doing that, it gets missed.
Hmm.
And ideally in this sort of, I feel like this um, ideal world, sure. Should you need to have my role? Absolutely not, because the idea is that it's embedded into everything. The reality is our systems have been created for, many years, not looking at the equity, diversity, and inclusion lens.
Well, what I'm really hearing from you is at the end of the day, like there needs to be a dedicated resource d- at a senior level, regardless of where they're sitting within the organization. It
Yeah,
can't just be something that's done off the side of somebody's desk in addition to another role that they might have. Is that a fair?
absolutely. Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
yeah, for
Yeah, I think
sure.
that's important for people to be thinking about. And with that in mind, like what are common misconceptions that you have experienced with respect to EDI?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think there's a few that,
Hmm.
that come to mind. One is that equity, diversity, and inclusion is a nice to have, you know,
Hmm. Hmm.
that that it's, as I say, sometimes it can be seen as being fluffy, you know.
Yep.
Um and really again looking at the data, talking about, I mean, I review and research, and look at data all the time around. I mean, McKinsey had a, report out that was saying that, companies with more than 30% of women executives were likely to outperform other companies that had a lower percentage, right? And also another kind of stat is for a 10% rise in women's executive representation, they saw an average of a 2.1% increase in the percentage of both women employees and women managers. So that really, that sort of that comment about when you see someone who looks like you, that role modeling, that they have made it, and that you can make it too. It
It's
really,
critical. Yeah, it's
yeah,
critical. And as you're saying,
yeah,
there's a financial benefit to having
absolutely.
diversity, equity, and inclusion within an organization.
Yeah. And then,
Hmm.
a couple other sort of myths, I will say, and I'm not sure if it's exactly a myth, but that it's, in a way, it's like everyone I've noticed has an opinion about equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is
Hmm.
wonderful that, they're invested. But I also think that there is this sort of, it's easy to implement, you know, that it can be done very quickly. You just need to do this,
Hmm.
and it really isn't. It is one huge change management exercise
It's a huge
as
undertaking.
you try. Yeah,
Yeah.
and you need to bring people along, and if you go too quickly, you lose people, and you have to sort of weigh out the risks. Is that okay? Can you come back and get them later? And so I think that for sure is a myth. And then the last one, and I think this is sort of a potentially a common one that we have to always, I think I'm always thinking of, is men, and particular white men,
Mhm.
feel like they don't have a place in the equity, diversity, and inclusion journey. Um, and and I think we have to be um, conscious of it. When we are rolling things out and we're communicating and we're talking about inclusion, and also we also have to address this piece about talking about the patriarchy, white supremacy, and things like that, and because these systems have been created for particularly men, and a lot of, I would say, for white men in general. And so we want to make sure that they come along and understand, and also there's accountability and self-awareness of sort of how these systems have worked in their favor, and we're looking to kind of, as I say, when we talk about equity, it's the access to opportunity. It's that you didn't, of course you had to work extremely hard, because I think that's the other thing we hear from people is well, I had to work just as hard, right? Which is, and it's, you're
We've
like,
got a whole podcast right in
yeah,
that
yeah,
stuff.
I think
Another
so
one.
too. Yeah, 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 yeah.
But really, I mean, I think what is coming across to me is again that need we need all sorts of allies
That's right.
and and educated allies, people who are taking time to read and understand and acknowledge
Yes.
privilege.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
I'm curious, as workplaces continue to evolve, and I mean, workplaces are evolving and changing, so quickly. How do you see the future of EDI and really its role in shaping an organization's culture? Do you think it's what do you think is going to be happening in the future? What's on your mind? What are you thinking about?
Yeah, well, and I will say, the world is changing. The diversity of our world is changing, and I think the different generations play an important part of
Hmm.
EDI as well. So, thinking about that when you look at the older generations versus the younger generations who are coming into the workplace, I think that there will definitely be more more focus on EDI in the future. I think that, whether the policies and practices change, I don't see them changing that much, shall I say, because they're
Hmm.
still sort of focused on equitable practices. And, we have seen flexible work, organizations through the pandemic, right, who couldn't work from home and all of a sudden you
Hmm.
were able to.
Hmm.
And then, I have seen also too within organizations the shift from, do we move EDI under the ESG, category, which is, environmental, social, and
Yeah.
governance, right? Because I still think when we talk about ESG, we just think climate. And then
Hmm.
there's those other social and governance pieces. So again, companies have to be strategic around this, depending upon their culture, their workforce, where it makes the most sense to get the work done.
And really consulting with someone like you as they're figuring out that strategy and where should EDI sit, and
Yeah.
I think is important. So if
Yeah.
you had to offer a piece of advice or wisdom or something to somebody just starting in EDI about, how to get started, what would it be?
You know, I would focus on trying to sort of read as much as you can, talk to other people who are doing the work. I mean, I have found really great, um, you know, other EDI
Hmm.
practitioners who have been so helpful with sharing, because no company should come to the end and win the EDI game. And it's not an EDI game, but no, we should be supporting each other,
Ongoing, yeah.
right? And really take the time in the organization to find out what's working and what isn't working with, and spend time with your employees, because those are the ones who are ideally, if you want to embed EDI, they're living and breathing it and doing the things when you're not there. So spend time with your employees.
Well, thank you for this. And I think my
Yeah.
takeaway is again, I love just that the emphasis again on that the communication piece. I think it's a good reminder for everybody how important that is.
Yeah.
And when you said, sometimes you're in it so much that you forget that not everybody is living and breathing it every day,
Yeah.
and so the message may be coming across a bit differently.
Yeah. Thanks.